What does it mean to live by your convictions? Well, let's look at what Daniel 1:3 through 21 has to say. It's important to understand that when your mate breaks your marriage vows, it can also break your heart. After the initial shock wears off, your driving desire can also be to hurt them through your vindictiveness. But you may be asking yourself, what should I do instead? Well, take the time to process your emotions. A quick "I forgive you" or just sweeping things under the rug will sabotage any hope of rebuilding a strong relationship. You see, if your mate is a habitual betrayer who wants to live as he or she pleases, God's word gives you the right to be set free from them. But wait a minute, don't move too quickly. Ask yourself if work or family pressures may have caused you to neglect each other. But now the real question happens. Did you inadvertently open a door for Satan to come through? You see, these are hard questions, but they must be answered, because the decisions you make right now are the ones that you have to live with for the rest of your life. You may not even believe it right now, but God can make a good marriage out of a bad mess. Yes, you have to realize it will take time, but trust can only be rebuilt slowly, and that means learning to be sensitive to one another. Now there's your challenge. Also, you have to realize that acknowledging that your mate may need detailed accountability and that you may have to go the extra mile to rebuild the trust that was once lost. It can't happen. The righteous cry out. The Lord hears and delivers them out of their troubles. You must always remember that the Lord is near to those who have a broken heart, and saves such as have a contrite heart, according to Psalms 34:17 through 18 in the New King James Version. You see, in Daniel 1:3 through 5, it says, Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table, and they were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter into the king's service. Now we find, according to Daniel 1:4, that the common language of Babylon was the Aramaic, while the language of the scholarship also included the ancient and complicated Babylonian language. The academic program would have included mathematics, astronomy, history, science, and magic. These young men demonstrated not only aptitude but also discipline. This character trait combined with integrity served them well into their new culture. In Daniel 1:6 through 7, we find among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. You see, according to Daniel 1:7, we find that Nebuchadnezzar changed the names of Daniel and his friends because he wanted to make them Babylonian, in their own eyes and in the eyes of the Babylonian people. You see, new names would help them to be assimilated into the culture. First of all, Daniel means God is my judge in Hebrew. However, his new name, Belteshazzar, means Bel, or protect his life. Bel, also called Marduk, was chief Babylonian god. Hananiah means the Lord shows grace. His new name, Shadrach, probably means under the command of Aku, or the moon god. Mishael means who is like God. His new name, Meshach, probably means who is like Aku. Azariah means the Lord helps, and his new name, Abednego, probably means servant of Negro or Nebo, or Nebu, the god of learning and writing. Now, what we must recognize that this was how the king attempted to change the religious loyalty of these young men from Judah's god to Babylonian's gods. According to Daniel 1:8 through 10, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, but he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned you food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Now what we must pay attention to is in Daniel 1 and 8, that Daniel was determined to be devoted to principle and to be committed to a course of action. When Daniel made up his mind not to defile himself, he was being true to a lifelong determination to do what was right and not to give in to the pressures around him. You see, we too are often assaulted by pressures that compromise our standards and to live more like the world around us. Merely wanting or preferring God's will and way is not enough to stand against the onslaught of temptation. You see, like Daniel, we must resolve to obey God, because if the pressures in life seem like crushing you down, think of a crushed grape that produces the best wine. The pressures you have in life only brings out the best in you. You see, man must cast out of himself everything which separates him from God. He must will to live the divine life, and he must rise above all moral temptations. He must forsake every course of action that is not in accord with his highest ideals. You see, it is easier to resist temptation if you have thought through your convictions before the temptation arises. If we look at Daniel and his friends made their decision to be faithful to the laws of God before they were faced with the king's delicacies, so they did not hesitate to stick with their convictions. You see, what we also find in Daniel 1:8 is that we will get into trouble if we have not previously decided where to draw the line. Before such a situation arises, decide on your commitments and what you will do. Then, when temptation comes, you'll be ready to say no. In Daniel 1:9, we find that God moved with an unseen hand to change the heart of the Babylonian official. The strong moral conviction of these 4 young men made an impact, and God promises to be with his people in times of trial and temptation, according to Psalm 106 and 46, Isaiah 43, 2 and 5, and 1 Corinthians 10 and 13. His active intervention often comes just when we take a stand for him. Stand for God and trust him to protect you in ways and you may not be able to see what he's about to do. Excitement is about to come, so take a stand. Anything short of complete obedience meant execution for the officials who served Nebuchadnezzar, according to Daniel 1 and 10. Even in such a small matter as this, the officials feared for their life. We have to remember that complete obedience is dedication through the rough no matter what happens. As we continue to look at the word in Daniel 1:11 through 14, Daniel then said to the guard to whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. Just wait till you see what happens. Oh my gosh, they created the Daniel diet. Daniel 1 and 12. The Babylonians were trying to change their thinking by giving them a Babylonian education, their loyalty by changing their names, and their lifestyle by changing their diet. Without compromising, Daniel found a way to live by God's standards in a culture that did not honor God. Wisely choosing to negotiate rather than to rebel, Daniel suggested an experimental 10-day diet of vegetables and water instead of royal foods and wine the king was offering. Without compromising, Daniel quickly thought of a practical, creative solution that saved his life and the lives of his companions. As God's people, we may adjust our culture as long as we do not compromise God's laws. Even in Daniel 1:15 through 16, at the end of the 10 days they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. Think about what this says about this diet. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine, and they were able to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning according to Daniel 1 and 17, and Daniel could understand the visions and dreams of all kinds. So we continue to see that Daniel and his friends learned all they could about their new culture, so they could do their work with excellence. But while they learned, they maintained steadfast allegiance to God, and God gave them skill and wisdom. Culture need not be God's enemies. If it does not violate his commands, it can aid in accomplishing his purpose. We who follow God are free to be competent leaders in our culture, but we are required to pledge our allegiance to God first. This does require steadfast allegiance. at the end of time set by the king to bring them into his service, according to Daniel 1:18-20, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in the whole entire kingdom. What does this say in regards to our work when it comes to the Lord and the excellence that He expects from us? We must seek godly wisdom in all we do. A good example of that is Nebuchadnezzar put David and his friends on his staff of advisors. That's because he recognized their expertise in what they were doing. This staff included many magicians and enchanters. There were even astrologers who claimed to be able to tell the future through occult practices. They were masters of communicating their message so that it sounded authoritative, as though it came directly from their gods. In addition to knowledge, Daniel and his 3 friends had wisdom and understanding given to them by God, and thus the king was far more pleased with them than his magicians and enchanters because of their expertise and their wisdom from God. As we serve others, we must not merely pretend to have God's wisdom, because our wisdom will be genuine when we are rightly related to God. Keep in mind that Daniel and his 3 friends were all dealing with new cultures and new lives, but how did the captives survive in a foreign culture? They learned about the culture, they achieved excellence in their work, they served the people, and prayed for God's help and maintained their integrity. We may feel like foreigners whenever we experience change. Even alien cultures come in many forms: a new job, a new school, a new neighborhood. We can use the same principles to help us adapt to our new surroundings without abandoning God anywhere along the way. So let's take a few minutes to get to know Daniel a little bit better according to Daniel 1:21. You see, Daniel was one of the first captives taken to Babylon, and he lived to see the first exiles return to Jerusalem in 538 BC. Throughout this time, Daniel honored God, and God honored him. While serving as an advisor to the kings of Babylon, Daniel was God's spokesman to the Babylonian Empire. Babylon was a wicked nation, but it would have been much worse without Daniel's influence. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to listen to this message in regards to Daniel and the wonderful things he did for God in Babylonia. Just know that God is truly alive in your lives, and He has just as many wonderful things for you in store. So should you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to respond back to you. Thank you, God bless, and have a wonderful week.